people who were actually employing you. So the first question is, how did this whole thing happen, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, so I think something, at least for me, people often ask, what made you decide to come out, or what was the moment? And for me, it was a gradual process. It wasn't actually a single moment. What people, I think, is important for them to understand is that when I first started, I worked at a different company. It was called SCL Group, which was a military contractor. Our clients were the British Ministry of Defense, the Pentagon, NATO militaries, and we were looking at how to essentially use artificial intelligence and data to better identify, for example, propaganda from Russia, or recruitment operations from terrorist organizations in North Africa, for example, because all of that happens online. We got acquired. Essentially, one of our clients from the U.S. Air Force was just randomly on a plane in the United States and met a guy who worked for Steve Bannon, and they just chatted on the plane about what he did and what he did. And he said, Air Force can't help you, but we will with some people who do some stuff that you might be interested in. And he met my Steve Bannon, then got introduced to my boss at the time, Alexander Nix. And they acquired the company.
How does military intelligence link with?
Well, so essentially, if you look at sort of what Steve Bannon wanted to do, when we use the term culture war, we actually have to unpack kind of, all right, so we're having a warfare within the domain of culture. And in the military, you've got what you call a multi-dimensional battle space. So you've got land, sea, air, outer space, and what they call the fifth dimension, which is information. So that's usually considered cyber or psychological operations. In order to fight a war in any domain, you develop weaponry that is geared towards operating in that domain, right? So a torpedo doesn't work on land, it works in the ocean, right? A surface-to-air missile is to take out something in the domain of air power. So in culture, your weaponry is information. Your weapons are narratives. And when we look at what a weapon typically has, you've got a payload system, you've got a targeting system, right? So it might be a scope on a gun and a ballistic of that gun, or it might be the targeting system of the missile with the payload of the missile. In culture, that is, your payload is a narrative, and your targeting system is data and AI. And what Steve Bannon was looking for was a way to optimize his ability to launch and fight a culture war, a war within the domain of culture. And so what appealed to him was that there were actually firms out there that were intimately familiar with how to fight or engage in what you could call cultural warfare, because when you are doing counterinsurgency operations, counter-extremism operations, or counter-propaganda operations, ultimately you're actually fighting a war within the domain of culture. We got acquired, and so the work that we were doing was then transferred over to Cambridge Analytica. It got set up, and a new company was formed, Cambridge Analytica. And so the technologies that we were working on, originally for the defense of Western society against external threats, was now being used, inverted and used upon the very citizens that we were originally out to protect. So Steve Bannon wanted to treat the average American voter in the same way that we would treat a recruiting agent for ISIS. And the important thing there is that when you have a military operation, the personal autonomy and agency and consent of your target is not a consideration for the military, because the way they look at it is, if you are recruiting or radicalizing people for a terrorist organization in North Africa, we can either send in a drone and incinerate you with weapons, with kinetic weapons, things that blow up, or we can confuse you, manipulate you, coerce you, scare you. We can warp your perception so you make mistakes that we then can exploit. And the way the military looks at it is that's actually a very passive form of engagement with a hostile belligerent. But when we look at what an election is, a fundamental assumption of an election is the autonomy and agency of people, and also their ability to share a collective understanding of reality. When we look at the sort of traditional idea of an election, you've got a candidate standing up on a stage kind of like this, and you've got an audience, right? And me as the candidate, I go up and I say what I think, I say my piece, and in that audience there may be an opposing candidate or party, there may be journalists, there may be civil society organizations, or just the average voter who just knows a thing or two about what I'm saying. And if I lie, I can be caught and I can be called out in public, and that's why we call it a public forum. But the problem with what's happening with the internet is that as a candidate, or any kind of, I could be a candidate, I could be a Russian disinformation unit, I could be whatever, I become invisible. And I can, instead of standing here where you all see me, I become invisible and I can go through this room like a specter and whisper into each and every one of your ears. And I can whisper something that is the same or different. And sometimes you don't even know that you're being whispered to, because I might look like your friend, I might look like a professor, I might look like a newspaper, I might look like a TV show, I might look like anything. And the other people around you don't even know that you're engaging with this. And so all of a sudden, what was once a public forum is now no longer a public forum, but an individualized conversation, an engagement is what big tech likes to call it. And the real problem then is that when you go and vote, or you start to engage in any kind of social activity, because democracy is more than just an election. If your reality is fundamentally different from somebody else's, I mean, that completely erodes the basis that any kind of functioning democracy has. And I think that's, and so and I think that's just really dangerous. When we look at the history of societies all around the world, when we start separating people, when we talk about the word segregation, or segregating, or ghettoizing people, right? What is fundamental in segregation, what's so dangerous about segregation is that it's not the literal physical proximity, it's the fact that we can share different perspectives and experiences and backgrounds. And when you look at the United States, for example, they had several decades of the civil rights movement to desegregate society, to put different people with different perspectives back into the same place. For that clash of views, that exchange of perspectives. You now have a society which has physically desegregated to an extent, but now with the internet, with segmentation, with personalization, with optimization, with these ad programs, we are creating a new form of segregation, except it's just cognitive segregation, right? We call it filter bubbles or whatever, but let's call a spade a spade. It's segregation. And what's so dangerous about that is that if we no longer share the same reality, and we can't even talk to each other anymore, then our society is at risk of breaking down in a really bad way. And when you then have people like Steve Bannon who want to break down society so that he can then remake it in his image, that's what's really scary. And what I saw, with Cambridge Analytica was a company that was doing that. It was doing it unlawfully. It broke the law. It was infiltrated by people who are now indicted by Mueller because they were also working for Russian intelligence services. The data went to Russia. And that man, at the time when I started talking to The Guardian, that man was on the National Security Council of the United States of America. That man was advising the President of the United States. And he had a database of every single American that was also being accessed by Russians, where he could have created his own private version of the NSA, and that's a really dangerous thing when you combine that with the office of the president and the weight of the government of the United States of America.
This sounds very scary indeed. Let me ask you something. What does it mean to be a whistleblower? What happens when you become a whistleblower? We had this discussion a little bit earlier. And I was very impressed by the fact of what you told me about all the legal preparation one needs to do and all
so
that.
let me be, I am an exception to a really unfortunate rule, which is most of the time whistleblowers, they get screwed. Totally fucked, excuse my French. But so when you look at people who take a stand against powerful organizations, oftentimes what happens is they see something, their conscience tells them to do something, and then they, in that moment, act, right? And it becomes a very visceral, emotional, reactive thing, and you just go and do it. So when you look at, for example, Edward Snowden, that's what happened. He went to Hong Kong, handed over stuff, and then had no plan. Like just kind of, and then what, right? I had the benefit of, and I'm very thankful for many people giving me the advice to go and talk to lawyers. I had the benefit of talking to some absolutely fantastic lawyers, some of whom also worked on the Guardian's case during the Snowden files, who understood the pitfalls and where the risk areas were for whistleblowers and the mistakes that often get made. And so from the very beginning, I talked to lawyers and I said, if you can create the perfect whistleblowing, what would that look like? And what would I need to do in order to make sure that I can get the information out in a way that's impactful, but I can protect myself from retaliation from whether it is the National Security Council of the United States of America, or the American intelligence, or Russian intelligence agencies, or private intelligence agencies, or big tech companies, or Cambridge Analytica, or the private contractors that they hire to do all kinds of unsavory things. And we spent an entire year meticulously planning, and that involved going to the legal authorities. That meant bringing on the New York Times as well as the Guardian, because there was a fear that the Guardian might get tied up in the British courts under defamation laws, which are much less stringent than in the United States. And Cambridge Analytica could have blocked the entire story from getting out. So we had a fail-safe in the New York Times. We went and talked to Channel 4, which is one of the large news organizations in the UK, because they specialize in undercover investigations. And so they went and we planned out this entire undercover operation to get into the company so that we could film the executives of the company admitting to crimes and talking about what they actually do with their own voice on camera. And what that meant was that there was no ability at that point for the company to block in the courts, and there was no ability for the company to come and attack me or sue me or saying I'm making it up, because they admitted everything on tape and on camera. What we didn't anticipate was the knee-jerk reaction of Facebook, because we thought that in the face of all of this overwhelming evidence, Facebook would just concede that they royally fucked up. But what happened was when they found out that the story was coming up, because we gave them extra time to respond, which is unusual. Papers usually give you, if you're a big company, they'll give you a day maybe to respond. We gave them like over a week because it was such a complicated matter and they were so integral in it, in good faith that they would come back and say, this is what we're going to do. Instead, what they did was Facebook sent me all kinds of legal threats. They also insinuated that they were going to report me to the FBI for cybercrimes, not realizing that actually they were a company under investigation and not me. But on the same day, the same lawyers at Facebook then sent a letter to the Guardian. And they said to the Guardian, none of this is true, we're going to sue you in court for defamation. So the day that they admit it's all true, to me, they lie to the newspaper and say none of it's true. Not kind of connecting the dots that I might walk over and talk to the Guardian and say, hey, did you get a letter from Facebook? Yeah, I tried. Do you want to share notes? Oh, look, they're lying to one of us. And when the CTO of Facebook at Parliament was asked about that, because he went to the parliamentary inquiry, because Mark Zuckerberg is such a coward that he can't handle scrutiny when you go. He said, when he was asked, why did you lie to the Guardian? about these allegations which you knew were true, he said that's just how we thought we dealt with journalists. We just thought that's how you deal with it. Not even apologizing or acknowledging that lying to journalists is just wrong. But because of the reaction of Facebook, they then banned me because they tried to shift the story and ban me. What that did was it showed where they were at. It showed their cards. It showed that actually they don't give a fuck. It shows that they cared much more about their share value, which dropped substantially, hundreds of millions of dollars they lost. It was the largest single-day drop of share value in any publicly traded company in history. And they didn't care about the society that they were operating in, the democracy that allows them to be a company, and the users who they use. They didn't care about that.
Let me ask you a question. We talk a lot about weaponizing the algorithm.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us with an example what this really means and how it can affect all of us in ways that we might not even be able to imagine today?
Sure. So I'll just give you like a tangible example so that we're not just talking in theory. So when you look at insurgency building in military operations, so for example, the goal is usually to undermine what you call a belligerent, a hostile organization. So a large narcotics ring in South America, for example. So the first thing that you do is you try to look for people within that organization who have particular kinds of traits. People who are more neurotic, more narcissistic, more prone to conspiratorial thinking. Traditionally, that takes a lot of human intelligence on the ground to identify people who are potentially like that, and the old school way was really risky and dangerous and all that kind of stuff. What we looked at, what we did, is we said, all right, well, because all these people will reveal discrete aspects about their personality online in the data, you call sort of the data exhaust, the things that they like or how they talk or what they click on, we can look for statistical relationships between particular traits and that data profile. And what we found was that we could establish significant relationships between those two things. So what that meant was you could then, first of all, create targets who were more prone to buying into conspiracy theories.
That means, excuse me to interrupt, but this means that you're doing covert operations using social media.
Yes, yes. And so taking that to the United States, taking that to building the alt-right, because fighting a war in culture, right? So we're fighting a war. What do you need to fight a war? You need troops. You need an insurgency, right? And so what Steve Bannon wanted to do was to take what the military does and build an insurgency in the United States. And so the first step was to identify named targets like John Smith at 123 Any Street, who is more likely to be more prone to believing conspiracy theories than any of his neighbors. Therefore, we should send things to him. And the things that first got sent to them would be in the form of AdWords, right? Things that they would likely click on. But then that was only the first step. The next step would be to then bring them into an environment where you can control everything around them. And that's really important because you need to gain what's called informational dominance. And so that, in this case, would be a chat forum, a news site, a Facebook group, anything where they all of a sudden, they then become a member and you can start playing with them. So they would join, for example, a Facebook group, right? Facebook's algorithm, the newsfeed algorithm at the time, was really sensitive to sort of outliers or things that were really different from the norm. So if you joined an extreme alt-right group, Facebook's algorithm would decide, this is what makes you a unique user, and I'm going to show you everything that's like this from now on. So first of all, boom, done. That takes care of the informational environment, right? So now every time they go on Facebook, all they see is alt-right propaganda. Second step is to then develop a relationship with them. So they would join a group, and then they would get a message, a direct message, hi, have you checked this out? And they would start chatting. They would chat with something that wasn't necessarily real, but looked like another average member, right? But it might be a bot, or it might be somebody sitting, on the other side of the ocean. And from that, this person would get deeper and deeper into these conspiracy theories. And once those groups reach sort of a minimum threshold of a couple thousand people for a particular geography, an event would be set up. And if only 5 to 10% of people showed up to that event, if you had a couple thousand members, that means 50 to 100 people might show up. So if you do it in a local coffee shop that can only fit 20 people, and 50 people show up, all of a sudden a person comes and they see this overflowing place with people who look like them, sound like them, and all they're talking about is stuff that you never see on the news. And they don't have an agenda because they're just a regular Joe, just like you. They couldn't possibly have an agenda. And so all of a sudden you build a degree of trust with these people that you would never have watching CNN or reading the New York Times. And then when you hear that everyone around you is talking about these things, and then you turn on CNN, that's fake news. There's an agenda there. These people don't have an agenda, they're telling you the truth. This is my truth. And what started as an online fantasy becomes their reality. And from that point, just in the same way that you're building an insurgency, once you have all of these little cells developed within an organization, or in this case, the electorate of the United States, you then push these microcells together to form larger cells so that they start organizing. And it's at that point that then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. All these cells meet, and now they have too many people to just talk to each other, and all of a sudden they have a leadership. And that leadership then decides to, from their own instigation, to organize events, marches, protests, recruitment, and then it becomes a movement.
So what do you do?
And that's what the alt-right is.
Yeah.
The alt-right was a very clinically created insurgency that started online.
And what are the steps to protect yourself from that? I mean, what are the steps one could have taken in the past and clearly didn't work? But what would one have done?
Well, what do you do about planes flying? Or what do you do about planes falling out of the sky? What do you do about cars that explode? You can't necessarily, if something is inherently dangerous, you can't necessarily, you as an individual, protect yourself from weaponized disinformation. The insidious thing about propaganda is that when you encounter it, you like it. Because it's targeted for you, it's curated for you, it's personalized for you, and you engage with it, right? So it's not about how you should protect yourself, it's about what these platforms should be doing to protect you. Just in the same way that if planes were falling out of the sky or buildings were collapsing, we wouldn't say, how do you protect yourself against planes that fall out of the sky? It's, why are people making planes that fall out of the sky? And so, the problem that that got revealed, I think, in this story is that we have literally cloned society online. And if you have a social profile, you have a phone, it tracks you all of the time, right? It listens to you, it watches you, it knows when you're on the bus, it knows what your routes are. And that is all sitting in the United States. That is at the control of an American company. So you've got the Greek electorate at the control of an American company.
You know we have elections in a few months.
Outside of the jurisdiction of the Greek government or the European Union. And that's a problem because what we've just done, we've literally cloned our society and handed it over to a company that has a lot of conflicting incentives, right? The reason, I'll tell you this, Facebook knew about this years before it came out, okay? They knew about it. I know, I have that in writing from the lawyers. They knew about this, right? They did fuck all. When their security teams went and told the executives told the security teams to shut up or we'll fire you.
Because it's bad for them.
Because it's bad for brands. Undermining democracy is bad for brands.
But is this what happened in Myanmar and Sri Lanka?
So, this is what's so frustrating is that Facebook talks about building global communities, right? But it doesn't give a fuck about small countries. It really doesn't. So when you look at Myanmar, and the case of ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims, the United Nations, this is not me, it's the United Nations said Facebook contributed to ethnic cleansing because it didn't do anything to stop the rampant disinformation and hate propaganda on its social networks, right? And why? Because it didn't have anybody who spoke Burmese. It was too small of a market. So it's fine to extract money from these people and mine their data, but God forbid we have to hire somebody who speaks their language, even when ethnic cleansing is happening. When in Sri Lanka, a similar thing happened where hate propaganda was being spread about Muslims in that country, and the Sri Lankan government formally notified Facebook and asked them to remove accounts that were spreading hate propaganda and disinformation, and they just didn't read the letter. Because it's Sri Lanka. It's not America. Who cares? I can't even point to it on a map. Who cares? Right? And so herein lies the problem, right? When we talk about national sovereignty, right, and our ability to make decisions for ourselves and our democracy on our terms, and we are now at the beck and call of these American tech giants, where our societies can be so fundamentally affected, but we can't do anything about it, that's a problem.
Is there a solution?
Oh. I think that there are, but it's not. We can't leave it to big tech companies to come up with solutions and enforce those solutions, because we can't. They have shown consistently that they cannot be trusted with our data. I think that when you look at the vast number of international treaties that we have treaties on things. Even like what happens to lost luggage on airplanes, right? It's called the Montreal Convention. If you fly from Greece to New York and you lose your luggage, there's an international convention on what happens, right? So if we have an international convention on like lost luggage or like things that what airport codes should be, right? Surely we can start talking about what are the ground rules for the internet, right? We've got non-proliferation treaties for weapons, right? You look at what Russia has done to the United States and to Europe, and I see that as an attack with a weapon of mass destruction. Because when you look at what does a weapon of mass destruction do? It causes widespread chaos and destruction that has long-term enduring effects on society, right? And you look at what Donald Trump is doing, or you look at the chaos that Brexit is causing to the European Union, and that is the byproduct of a weapon of mass destruction. It is just a cyber weapon of mass destruction, an informational, a cultural weapon of mass destruction. So if we have negotiations on a country-to-country basis on what's allowed or not allowed in terms of warfare, we should also be having conversations about what is allowed and not allowed in terms of information warfare. A. B. We should be looking at what are international solutions to collectively, as in the international forum, regulating social media companies.
You mean beyond terms and conditions?
Beyond terms, these are architectures. We do not have terms and conditions for architectures in any other circumstance. You cannot walk into a building without fire exits, and because there's terms and conditions on the outside that say we don't conform to the building code because of our user experience and brand concepts. Sorry, it's bullshit. Right? When you buy a car, there's no terms and conditions with the car, right? There's safety standards, right? And those are enforced, right? Building codes, there's even international norms for building codes. So why can't we have international norms for the architecture of the internet? And, yes, there are many different parts of the world that have very different ideas of what's allowed and not allowed in terms of things like speech and whatnot. But I think that we can probably all agree that a private company allowing the manipulation of minds at the behest of an advertiser should not be allowed.
Many analysts have talked and commentators have talked about deregulation of big tech in the lines of the Sherman Act of 1900. Is that something that makes sense to you?
I mean, do you know what I think is an interesting? I think seatbelts are an interesting thing to look at. When you look at why do we have seatbelts in cars now? In the United States, because it has, it's the last sort of developed country that seems to not have public health care. It's private insurance companies that pay for medical costs. And before seatbelts were mandatory, insurance companies were getting really sick and tired of paying for the mangled bodies of people who were the victims of unsafe products. And so they went and they lobbied Congress. And it's probably the only good thing that an insurance company has ever done is lobby Congress for better safety standards in cars. And what did the auto industry say? They said, no, this is going to inhibit innovation, right? We're now going to have to constantly consider all these seatbelts in our cars and we can't make new models. it's up to the driver. It's the driver's choice. If they don't want to use their car, they don't have to. But they went and bought it, right? And we'll give the option. We'll make it an opt-in. You can get a seatbelt if you ask for it, right? And we all know that that's bullshit. I mean, you get in a car that didn't have seatbelts, right? You get in a car that wasn't built to any national safety standards. Probably not. And so I think that the lesson there is that industries usually only react when there is significant money on the line. And so I think also beyond regulatory frameworks, we have to start thinking about how to catalyze market incentives for companies to start valuing the breach of your data as much as they value the utility of your data for advertising.
Do you think GDPR, like we have in Europe, is a way towards this? Is it something that will...
I mean, like, it's okay. I mean,
it's a burden to most of the people here.
It doesn't, like, I think it just, like a lot of things that Europe does, it misses the point. Like, it has a nice intention, but it's like so poorly written, poorly executed, and clunky, and doesn't understand how any of these technologies work. So, like, you know, here, like one of the things that I found out, I went and asked a bunch of lawyers in Europe about like the ECHR, for example. Do I have a right to self-determination? Do I have a right to reality? Do I have the right to my own truth and not being warped by it? It's that you don't. I mean, you don't, because it assumes that you have free will. I don't have a right to free will encoded in the law because the law assumes that I have free will. If you see what I'm saying. So if we start looking at AI as an architecture, right? Okay, we are putting ourselves in an architecture that we're building where AI is thinking about us, is watching us, and you know, if we start looking at like the development of 5G and Internet of Things and blah 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 blah, right? 10 years down the line, where your house is thinking about you, your cars are thinking about you, your house talks to your car, and your car talks to the road, the car decides actually maybe you should or shouldn't be late for work depending on your subscription, right? And your house mediates the information that you have access to, and your children's toys start teaching your kids things, right? And all of a sudden we're living in this environment that is watching us, thinking about us, and trying to influence or penalize us depending on how it decides it wants to optimize our behavior, right? Where the fuck is GDPR in that, man? Because you've opted into all of it. You want the smart house, you want the cool thing, you want the cool car, you want all of this stuff. It's really convenient, and you press accept, 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 accept. But what happens is it warps your whole fucking reality. And so the problem with GDPR is that it like misses the whole fucking point. We should not obsess over consent because we don't obsess over consent for safety, right? We don't talk about opt-ins or consent for architectures and buildings or engineering standards for airplanes or cars or whatever, right? Because it's too hard to know what you're consenting to. You don't understand the engineering of a fucking airplane. Well, I don't. Right? And so why is it that we like have this whole framework around like consent when it should be the things that work and are safe from the outset, where we don't need terms and conditions because there's a uniform wrong. Its whole mindset is wrong because it doesn't understand where technology is going. It's trying to solve yesterday's problem, and it's doing it in a really clunky way. You look at all of these EU regulations that consider the fucking cookie thing. When was the last time you actually said, no, I don't want the cookie, and I'm going to go through and like granularly click all the things that I don't want? No one does it. So what happens is you do consent washing, right? It allows companies to go, oh, we have consent, so now we can do anything, right? But on the flip side, it also inhibits things that might actually not be that harmful for people might want.
One last question.
Yeah.
We have been, we have scared us a little bit with what you're saying, and it's all about something that many of us here are working for, which is engagement. I mean, you've turned engagement from...
You know what has great engagement rate? You know what has great engagement rate? Smoking. Right? Engagement, like, we need to start to unpack this fucking word. Because if we're creating, why is it that why do we need to put, for example, how many friends you have in public on Facebook or on Instagram or Twitter or whatever? Why is that? Because it makes it more addictive. Why do we have screens that never end, right? Because it activates a ludic, which is the precursor to like gambling addiction. When you have repetitive tasks that give you an occasional reward, like a slot machine, right? So we're creating slot machines, right? And so if we're using this mantra of engagement all of the time, we have to ask, is this good engagement? Or is this the precursor to some kind of addiction? Are we wasting people's time? And so I think that, and what I would say, keep in mind, I work in the private sector now, right? I work for H&M, a large fashion company, right? And so I'm not opposed to making money. I'm not opposed to advertising. But what I think that we need to do is take a step back and go, what is the nature and quality of what we're doing to people and our customers? And first of all, recognize that our customers have innate humanity, and we should respect that. But also start to strive towards using AI in ways that help people and are beneficial to people, and start tackling problems within our own industries with AI rather than constantly creating addictive products and ads.
Okay, now we're running out of time. A few questions from the audience.
Okay.
Can I have one question? Just one question. The question is, what do you think the future of digital publishing looks like? But you have to make it a short answer.
Oh.
Because they're gonna.
God knows. I think it can go in a lot of different ways. I think the future of digital publishing is going to be obviously integrated with everything. I don't think that publishing will necessarily be like how it used to be, where it's considered just a part of media, the media landscape. It's going to be integrated into appliances and every aspect of our lives will be involved in publishing. Your kitchen will publish things. And so publishing, I think, will no longer be publishing per se. It will just simply be curating ambient environments. And that is powerful and potentially dangerous. And I think that we need to do it in a way that's respectful for people.
Thank you very, very much.